everybody. I can see some of you, and it's nice to be back with you. Now, today I'll be talking specifically about mindfulness and mindfulness in relationships. And I have already talked about that from different angles in these free classes, but I'll be reviewing some of the topic because just to get you thinking. But I'm assuming that most of you have had one of my classes before, and so you'll find out that everything I say in some way or another is a part of a facet of some bigger thing. And the bigger thing is always about how we can use conflict and difficult connections in order to deepen our love and care for each other. And because the idea being that that human beings, that our species, Homo sapiens, have this sort of negativity bias. We tend to remember what's wrong, what doesn't go well, what we don't like, how we've been hurt, and so on, rather than what does work well. Consequently, we often blame others and enter into conflict with others because we have the experience either that we're at odds with each other, or that our needs aren't getting met, or that we've been hurt or harmed by the other. This difficulty goes all the way from the family to the nation to the world. So all the way from small hostilities to war. It's always the same thing. So mindfulness is actually a certain way of regarding your experience. And as I've mentioned in here and the other classes many times, I define mindfulness as the combination of concentration and equanimity. Concentration being your ability to focus on a particular object of your awareness, no matter what it is, whether it's a pain in your foot or the flame of a candle or a particular domain of your experience. So the concentration part of mindfulness is like the straight spine. When you're in a posture for mindfulness, it allows you to focus. And then the other aspect of mindfulness, equanimity, the word equanimity is often not used in English, but I think it's a very good word. Equanimity refers to a kind of balanced attention, and it's something like a friendly attitude, or you could say a gentle, matter-of-fact attitude towards your experience. So concentration, equanimity. Concentration is the focus, equanimity is the relaxation. Concentration means that you can pay attention. Equanimity means that you can pay attention even when you're in pain. You can pay attention no matter what your experience is because your attitude is open. And when you put the two of these together, you have this amazing new lens for looking through. And if you've been in my other classes, you realize that I talk about your subjective world as a snow globe. So we're all enclosed in this kind of bubble or snow globe, which is anywhere from 45% to 85% or more idiosyncratic or individual. From moment to moment, our experiences are different from each other. So we don't agree on many, many things because we're having different experiences of those things. So you could think about your snow globe as having a glass or a lens that you look through. And when you're looking through your snow globe, if your snow globe is shaken up, you might be looking at the shake-up inside of yourself, or you might be looking through the glass. To clarify that glass as much as possible, mindfulness will help you. So it helps you clarify your perceptions. So you can actually come to learn how to hear what you're saying to yourself and hear what the other person is saying to you at the same time, because you can take what you're saying to yourself and move it into the background, kind of like a radio playing or white noise, and open up your ears to what someone is actually saying to you. That's a pretty developed skill, and yet not out of anybody's reach as long as you're conscious. So you could think of mindfulness as a cultivated awareness. It does happen to everyone from time to time that they clarify their perceptions, but to be able to use it as an ongoing skill, you have to cultivate it. It doesn't come naturally, and particularly in times of emotional agitation, irritation, and, as I again have said many times, emotional threat. So when you feel threatened, whether it's through emotions, anxiety, or it's because of fear, like you're really in danger, then you begin to react through your limbic system, which will essentially motivate you to either fight or to flee. And those motivations will tend to lead you to want to predict and control. And that means that you stop listening and you stop actually being able to see. You're usually overtaken with your desire to control or manage what's going on. So when you're using mindfulness in your relationships, what you will be wanting to do always is first to cultivate a little bit of equanimity. And an easy way to do that is to put your awareness on something that is neutral, even like a neutral sensation, like the feeling of air on your face. That's a neutral feeling. You can even do this to make yourself feel it. And also sometimes your clothes on your skin is a neutral feeling, your feet on the floor. So if you put your awareness on one of these neutral sensations, it starts to cultivate equanimity. Now, of course, a lot of people learn mindfulness through putting their awareness on the breath. The breath is a body sensation, and it can be a useful way to cultivate mindfulness. But what I find in working with people, particularly in couples when they're in conflict, is that putting your mind on the breath sometimes increases your anxiety, because the breath can get short and then you can feel more anxious. Similarly, anything else that resembles anxiety, for example, if you're in a cold room and the air conditioning is on and you start to shiver, that can actually sort of flow over into seeming like it's anxiety. It can increase your anxiety because it seems like it's anxiety, just like the air on your face gives you a feeling of equanimity, but actually, you know, you're not cultivating equanimity, you're just kind of borrowing the sensation. So your mind wants to borrow sensations sometimes. So when you focus on the breath, sometimes that can increase your anxiety. If you're practiced at it, it can lead to equanimity. But the overall framework for mindfulness is that you can keep both of those potentials going. That is concentration and equanimity throughout an experience, so that you can pay attention to it and also receive it. You don't block yourself against it. There's a lot more that I can say that I hope I'll be able to say through your questions. One other thing that I want to say about mindfulness itself: there are a lot of teachers of mindfulness. I take a lot of my paradigm for teaching it right now from Shinzen Young and his work in unified mindfulness, and you can look that up online. His name is Young, Shinzen, Shinzen. And I also have many videos now on YouTube, and I have a TED Talk that deals with some of the things we're going to talk about today. I believe that people can cultivate mindfulness in methods that do not include meditation necessarily. I actually do have many years in meditation practice, and I live in a small retreat center. I have a meditation, a Zendo, so-called, in my home. So I have nothing against meditation, but in order to benefit from meditation, you have to practice it both kind of intensely and also over a period of time. So I think it takes you about 2 years of regular practice that would include daily meditation, anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, and then going to maybe 1 or 2 extended retreats that are at least a day, but preferably 3 or 4 days, going to retreats like that 3 times a year. I think 2 years of practicing daily plus 3 of those kinds of retreats each one of those years will get you to a point where you're able to use your meditation skills when you're walking around. Because meditation, first of all, when you're learning it in a concentrated environment, it requires physical exertion. It's tiring. And secondly, it can seem to a lot of people to be boring or painful. So you have to overcome those experiences in order to really learn meditation practice. In order to bring it into your walking around life so you can access it when you're talking to other people, when you're agitated, when you're cleaning your house and so on, you have to practice it enough that it becomes essentially it's not exactly a preferred mode of being, but it's almost your preferred mode of being. So the reason that I say that mindfulness can be learned in other methods in addition to meditation is that I think that we can bring it on board in learning a certain form of conversation that I call real dialogue. I think we can also bring it on board when we're working with the people that we care about. And it always begins with your own intention to bring it on board. That's the most important thing. And then, as the Buddha reminded us in giving it the name that he gave it the name Sati, S-A-T-I in Sanskrit, which means recollection or remembering. And so what the Buddha meant by that is that when you're walking around, when you're doing stuff, you have to remember that there is another way to actually be aware other than your habits, the negative habits, especially of your mind. So sati means recollection or remembering. Mindfulness itself has meant essentially paying attention in English. And then following Shinzen's work, I define it as the combination of concentration and equanimity. So I think this is where I'm going to stop now and ask for questions. And I think that Lori is going to have you do something to ask the question.
Yeah, people should be able to unmute yourselves, which is a little blue button if you hover over your name. And sometimes it just takes a minute for your voice to come through. And I guess, people will have to defer to one another as they ask questions, but I think we'll find a groove in it. And if you'd prefer, you could also send a question to me and I will ask it if you'd prefer not to ask it in person.
So you say it's to be able to use meditation in your everyday life.
Yes.
You need to start with, starting in by doing the still meditation, a quiet environment, and for the rest of it. What about trying to do the meditation while you're walking?
So you're
I'm in the bus and try to meditate while I'm there in the bus during my bus ride or something like that.
Well, so if you're learning so we want to distinguish here between meditation and mindfulness, right? Because mindfulness, I think you can cultivate that in any activity. And you cultivate it by lowering the emotional threat level, and you begin to concentrate and try to keep some equanimity. If you're learning mindfulness through meditation, if that's your principal way of learning it, then when you're actually learning it in a formal setting, yes, you should have a setting that is quiet enough that you can actually pay attention to your own subjective experience, bringing the principles of whatever meditation you're using. Because again, there are many kinds of meditation, and there are many practices and methods. So if you are meditating and you're learning to meditate, yes, then you can bring that same practice into play when you're riding the bus, when you're sitting in the car, when you're even when you're out walking and running. But part of the problem is, if you're not very good at the meditation, your mind will wander immediately, and you may not then bring it back for a rather long time. If you're pretty practiced at meditating, it's kind of like lifting weights or learning a physical exercise. You get stronger at it. So then if you use it when you're on the bus or you're running, you will notice when your mind wanders more easily. So you can use meditation practice in many different settings, but in order to achieve a level of mental awareness where you actually pretty much can decide how to use your mind, does take some time of formal practice. That's what I was saying. Does that make sense, Artemis?
Yeah, that makes sense. But thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. But I think that using dialogue and using real dialogue, as we've learned together, also, when you use the method of see, hear, feel that we've been, learning,
Yeah.
that when you bring it into the dialogue, it's a very good way of strengthening the meditation muscles, even if you haven't had, retreats in meditation practice. It strengthens the mindfulness muscles. So you can actually learn mindfulness through various kinds of practices, but meditation is one of those that's been used traditionally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I've been getting a couple questions on the chat, and I'll ask. Someone asked you to please define equanimity again and say more about the attitude of equanimity.
Okay. So equanimity is, I like the definition, a gentle, matter-of-fact awareness. And it is like a gentle touch to your experience. You're in contact with your experience. Sometimes I give the example of surfing, even though I've never surfed, that you're on a surfboard and you're trying to keep your balance so that you can keep surfing. And so in order to keep your balance, you don't overreact when your board goes this way or overreact when it goes that way. You keep your awareness kind of level so that you stay on the board. Sometimes you see the same thing when people are doing various kinds of professional sports. I see it particularly in ice skating, that equanimity is the skater's ability to work with all of the twists and turns and ups and downs with a steady level mind. And that means that skater is able to make use of all of these different kinds of information without freaking out. So, in some ways, equanimity is the opposite of freaking out. Also, another way to think of equanimity is that it's kind of like a welcoming attitude. Like even if you're in pain, you sort of say to your pain, "Oh, there you are. Oh, okay, there you are." I like the idea also that we can cultivate a friendly attitude towards all of our experiences, even the most difficult ones, because that friendly attitude actually allows us to use mindfulness. And here's the other thing about mindfulness. Mindfulness slows down our perceptions. So at the extreme, equanimity allows you to go through really painful experience and it slows it down. It's kind of like if you've ever been in a car crash or when you were having a baby or whatever, and time and space seemed to slow down and open up. And it was as though you could witness every single nanosecond of what happened. It was so different than ordinary awareness. At its root, equanimity allows you to do that. That's kind of extreme, but I actually think those great surfers and those great skaters, I think that's what the way they're using equanimity.
So there's another one here on the chat. It says, Polly, can you be more precise as to which activities cultivate mindfulness?
Okay, so I'm going to say this is so difficult because I'm teaching a class on real dialogue. It's called Living Together Without Falling Apart. Real dialogue is an activity that cultivates mindfulness. And the skill has 3 components: speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, and remaining curious. It's actually a conversational form of mindfulness in which you keep track of your own subjectivity in such a way that you can keep your eyes and your ears and your feelings open, even though someone is talking to you about something that's very, very agitating. So that's one of the methods. And I think it's a very, very good method for practicing mindfulness and learning it for everyday life. Another method is one of, this is something I talk about in the TED Talk. Eliminate for just a day even, eliminate every mirror, every plate glass that you look into. Try it for 3 days, it's even better. Take away all the images that give you a reflection of your own image. And you will find your concentration and equanimity just naturally increase. Your mindfulness increases because what we do a lot is we cultivate self-consciousness. It really is our natural state. And I would argue that, you know, the original Homo sapiens who lived without all of the protections and removal from their immediate experience, the hunter-gatherers, those types of guys or gals or whatever they were the beings that were out there in the woods. They were living with high degrees of mindfulness because they couldn't see themselves. They weren't focused so much on, am I doing a good job, or how does this compare to what you're doing, and is your family better than my family, and all of these kinds of disruptive self-consciousness, that they were actually concentrating with greater equanimity because they also had to do everything from A to Z every day. And so they were, it turns out their brains were larger than our brains. Turns out that they had better health and even greater longevity in some cases. So there is something in your nature, if you have to pay close attention and you have to also be open to your experience, it's there. What disrupts it a lot is self-consciousness. Now, what I also think is the case, and I've heard this argued, there's something called, you know, being in the zone or flow experience, optimal experience. It's pretty close to mindfulness. The way that it's not exactly mindfulness is that it tends to depend on an activity, like the ice skating or the chess playing or whatever. In other words, people use that when they're in that activity, but they don't have the intentional capacity to take it into other kinds of activities, or by accident, the rock climber brings it into another activity. So there are many kinds of activities and attitudes that allow us to remove the self-consciousness and to focus more on being in contact with our actual experience. And when we do that, we cultivate mindfulness. So those are the things that come to mind. I think in the TED Talk where I talk about this, I think I also mentioned just a little activity that Thich Nhat Hanh, who is the Vietnamese mindfulness teacher, he's a Zen teacher, talks about, which is that when you come into a room, when you go through the doorway, to just take a pause and notice in the room, that you're coming into the room. And then you might notice also, is there something calling out to you in the room? So it's, again, just slowing it down when you come through the door. So those are the things that, for me, come to mind. I do think it's important to mention that mindfulness is not a method for calming down. You may calm down, and calming down may be part of it, but when you do mindfulness meditation, what it does is brighten up. It brightens up your perceptions and all of your senses. So it's almost like the engagement with experience is stronger. So it's not a disengagement, it's an engagement. And I think there's some confusion around that. So that when you're fully engaged in your experience and flow, optimal experience also, you have that full engagement, what happens is that your experience of yourself or your limits seems to fall away. And so that's mindfulness.
I have a question. Could you talk, thank you so much for all you said, so it's very helpful. Can you talk a little bit about mindfulness and relationship? The question that I came to this for.
Okay, so again, relationship is such a broad category. And so it goes all the way from, when your baby comes out of the womb and you look at the face of the baby, all the way to you're dying with your loved ones around you. And at every stage of life, it's very different, right? And so all of the components that go into relationship make it a little difficult to talk about exactly what to do. So there are some general ways to bring mindfulness into all of your relationships. But if you're relating to a little baby, you're relating to a child, you're relating to a teenager, to a young adult, to a middle-aged person, to an old person, those are all different kinds of relationships, and they require different ways of bringing mindfulness in. But in general, lowering your emotional threat level. What that means is to cultivate this equanimity so that you have the feeling of being open to the experience. Because the natural feeling that we have in relating to others is self-protection. That is a result of many things about our species, but in general, the issue is that we're very complex. It takes a lot to essentially drive the car if you're a human being. And having so much on board means we tend to form a self that is protected. And so that protection and that self-consciousness interrupts our ability to pay close attention to others or even to our own experience. And so lowering the threat level, cultivating equanimity, and then when you cultivate that equanimity, if possible, step back from your own snow globe in the way that I've been talking about snow globes. I mean, if you've got the skill to actually experience your own subjective experience so that you know what's going on there, and then let it drop into the background so you could see, hear, and feel the other person as they're expressing to you whatever it is they're expressing. That's the very best. That's always the highest level where you can work with yourself and the other person together. And so that's just the general overview. Does that help?
Yes, that's helpful, but it also makes me laugh because we try to once a week talk to 2 3-year-old twins on this medium, and we've been finding ways to do it. Like we read them little stories and stuff like that that they can see, and also I've been reading them stories about being grumpy, and they love that. They love those stories because they're in the house and they must be feeling grumpy. But I love what you're saying about equanimity, because it's sort of like sometimes on the other side of the screen, someone screams, or, someone falls over, or, things happen over there.
Right.
And so the only way I can sustain it is actually through equanimity.
Right. So yes, well, you're pointing out a number of things too that I was on a podcast for the last 2.5 hours in an interview myself about working with children and families in this shutdown. We're deprived of so much. And so you're deprived of touching or being physically with these children. And if you were with them, you might find your surfboard a little differently, because you could catch somebody if they're falling over or whatever. Now that you can only see them on a screen, it's true that then you're having to work with what you are seeing and what you believe they're experiencing, and finding equanimity with that. I think that the difficulty that we're having tremendous difficulties through deprivation of contact with our species during this time. And I do think that makes all of us extra grumpy. It's, I just want to mention this because I ended up talking about it quite a bit in the interview, and it does have something to do with the gap, what's called, like I call it, a mindful gap, that for when human beings typically are in their regular life, we have contact with strangers as well as contact with our families. And that gives a space for us. When we're with strangers, they don't attribute a lot of intentional meaning to us. They just say hi and pass by and so on. And so they're not actually seeing us as motivated badly towards them, or even necessarily well towards them. So being around strangers does foster a kind of equanimity with our species. We can, especially familiar strangers, where we say hi and move on and so on. So a good part of our daily life typically involves us with being in the world with strangers. And then we come home, and it's much more tangled up at home, where everybody is in some ways in competition for their needs, their desires, their hurts and pains and so on. And usually we can bring that freshness from the world back into the home. Now that everybody's locked down at home, home is a much more difficult place, and we have to bring in that mindful space without the strangers. The strangers bring it to us. It's like world and home are the two environments that are in dialogue in our lives most of the time. And now we just have home. So I think the issue of having some kind of space between you and others so that you can receive their communications with some openness is something that has to be cultivated more than usual because of the lockdown.
That's what we're finding.
We
also find that we love just saying hello to people in the park. We like we say, like in our town, we're all saying hello to everyone. We're all
you realize the value of that familiar stranger, that person that doesn't know you well. They have tremendous value in your life.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have one on the chat here that says, I've been meditating for a few years regularly, but struggle every time I have to interact with a supreme narcissist in my family. All of my training seems to go out the window. Do you have any tips or strategies for dealing with this type of person better, or anyone who consciously or unconsciously pushes my buttons?
Well, that's a great question. That was more of that. That was the type of question I expected, actually. But so thank you for asking it. First of all, just in terms of meditating, so I can say that it's kind of a test of your meditation, and it gives you a mirror to see where you are in your meditation, to discover how you deal with a person who really pushes your buttons. So you could think of that as being kind of like it's sort of like measuring. If you don't really want to measure your mindfulness, but it does give you some feedback as to whether you have achieved a degree of equanimity and concentration that you can pay attention even when someone is really pushing your buttons. So now I'll say something about narcissism. I did see a very funny video the other day made by this guy who's a well-known comedian online. He has red hair, kind of red ponytail. I don't know his name. I've seen some of his videos. And he said that he keeps getting contacted by people who say, I'm living with a narcissist. And he has found that since this lockdown occurred, everybody seems to be living with a narcissist. And so he went into the idea that that there's sort of a patheticist and a narcissist living together. One person feels pathetic, the other person feels like they have to dominate. And he says both people underneath are feeling very vulnerable. I thought it was actually a very funny and a nice little video that all of us do have a lot of vulnerability. And if we cannot experience that directly, the vulnerability being that, you know, we have needs and wants and weaknesses, and we make mistakes and failures and so on. If we have to protect ourselves against it with a hard shell, we probably a narcissist. If we protect ourselves against it by feeling like a victim, we're probably a patheticist in his language. So thinking about somebody who protects herself or himself by making a kind of hard shell, you might have more compassion for the person if you realize that there's some vulnerability there that's being protected against. So the very first thing I would say about using mindfulness in relationships is to try to keep all labels limited. Labels actually are not helpful, and yet we use them to sort the world out. And I also think that over time, for some reason, North America has become more sort of labeling in psychiatric labels rather than just complaining about people. You know, instead of saying my aunt is mean, you know, people say my aunt is a narcissist. Or instead of saying somebody's anxious, somebody says they're obsessive. Or so for some reason we've moved to these psychiatric labels. This has not always been the case in my life because I've been doing therapy now for many decades, and it's only recently that people have come in, I'd say in the last 4 or 5 years, and given diagnoses to their partners instead of just describing to me what their partners are like. So I would drop all of the lingo around diagnosing, diagnostic categories. I don't like them at all, really, but sometimes they're useful if you have to give a diagnosis. But if you don't, drop it. And then begin to take that emotional threat level lower in yourself, you know, remembering that you've got some skills. So let's see if you can cultivate some equanimity and some mindfulness while listening to this person speak to you. And instead of listening primarily to your own words about the person, that is, how self-centered they are, or what an asshole, or how wrong they are, instead of listening to those words, see if it's possible to listen to the words that the other person is saying, and then try to check out with them if you've understood them. If they give you that opportunity, say something like, you know, as I've been listening to you, I think I'm understanding that you experience things, or you feel this way, or you have this impression about things. Did I get that right? Just see if you can check it out. And so what you're doing there is that you're sort of eliminating what people often call the ego. You are diminishing your own narrative about how everything is in order to listen to somebody else and maybe even be curious about what the other person is saying. So many times when we encounter somebody who pushes our buttons, we protect ourselves and promote ourselves by our labels and ideas about the other person, instead of actually hearing what the person is saying or trying to step into their snow globe to see what it's like in there. What's it like from that point of view? And if you get this skill down where you can use your mindfulness to step into somebody else's experience, then almost nothing can take you down in conversation. You know, you could sit down and have a conversation with someone who has completely different politics, who has a completely different sense of what we should do with the pandemic and so on. And you could go through that conversation because you would recognize that that's a world that's different from yours. And that because you're a mindfulness practitioner, you actually want to bring some equanimity, concentration to your experience and then to the world. You want to demonstrate to others that it's possible to talk about difficult things without hurting or harming somebody else. So that's kind of a long answer, but I think it's a really good question. And I think it's at the root of why we ever practice meditation, is to be able to bring mindfulness and equanimity into the world. And it does mean sometimes really just dropping our own opinions about how other people are.
Yeah, there's actually sort of a build question on that. So have you ever witnessed equanimity as a bypass of difficult emotional expression?
Not at all. It's very different from passive aggression. Passive aggression is when people walk away, they shut down, they procrastinate, they stonewall, they don't answer. Those are passive aggressions. Equanimity is friendliness, it's openness. So it can't be a bypass, it's contact.
Hi, my name is Geeka. I'm in Texas. I have a question for you, but also thank you. I started following you many years ago when you came to Houston to the Jung Center there. And I feel like I've learned so much from you in so many different ways. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Geeka. Thank you.
And my question is, you mentioned in developing the skill of meditation or the practice of meditation, there's a physical discomfort, there's a physical effort that you go through. And I'm curious about how much that discomfort at best contributes to or is necessary for the development of the skill of mindfulness. And also, if you come to mindfulness from other experiences, how much painful experiences and getting through those is an important part of developing this equanimity and the ability to concentrate. And in thinking about that, I'm also thinking about some of what you've said in the past about resilience.
Well, great. They're all sort of great questions and levels in a particular issue. So the first one about meditation practice, when it's done in a formal way, and particularly in the Buddhist tradition, I would say especially in the Buddhist tradition, does assume that you will have a lot of physical discomfort as well as emotional discomfort. And yes, you build equanimity by tolerating that. And in some practices, particularly in Zen practice, there are disciplines and constraints in the practice that really amount to a kind of titrated trauma. You know, like you're not allowed to move for, say, 40 minutes. You have to sit without moving, because that's the skill you're developing, is to be able to tolerate whatever happens to you during those 40 minutes without moving. And so, and that's just one of the methods. I mean, there are other methods in Vipassana. The Goenka method also requires what they call strong determination. It's a 45-minute sit, and you do that twice a day in a 10-day retreat without moving. So yes, lots of the methods for learning mindfulness practice within the Buddhist tradition require what I would call a lot of ordeals. And so they're like ultra sports or something, you know. And I think that there are great gains that you can make from these practices, but they also require a lot of dedication and effort. I also think that even after people do those extreme practices, I mean, this is not a thought, actually, this is, I've worked in therapy with Buddhist teachers and also, you know, longtime practitioners, both in couples therapy and individual therapy. And I can see that the practices don't necessarily translate into better relationships. In part, that's because some of the practices are solo. I mean, you're actually practicing in your own subjectivity, even though you're practicing in a community or a group. And some of them, such as some Zen practices are group practices. It's the whole group together, sometimes chanting, sometimes practicing various kinds of work together, and so on. So Buddhist mindfulness practices focus on the individual or the individual in a group. They rarely focus on the dyad. You might be meeting with your teacher, but you're not cultivating an awareness of how that's going and whether you're perceiving each other accurately, whether your teacher is an accurate witness of you, whether you're an accurate witness of your teacher. So I think that even with very, you know, developed meditation practice, you can still miss that in a relational environment. You might not be able to bring it in when you're emotionally activated. So that's sort of one reason why I think it's useful to learn mindfulness practice in a relational environment. I also think that these cues, like the Thich Nhat Hanh cue when you walk through the doorway, or the just take down all of your mirrors, don't look into a mirror for a day or two and see what happens. I think those bring about somewhat of our natural tendency towards concentration and equanimity. And that once people get a taste of that, I think they want to bring it in more. Now, what I find again, so having done a lot of extreme meditation practices myself, in my early years of practice, some of the experiences were overwhelming, both emotionally and physically. I learned a tremendous amount from those. But I was also researching and writing about resilience during that time. I had a lot of trauma in my own childhood, and I understand how trauma can translate into resilience and into transcending ordinary boundaries of the self. However, there are a lot of people who don't understand that and can be traumatized by intensive meditation practices. And I think there's some of that now is being understood in a bigger way. There are people writing about it. There are people also instructing meditation differently, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of like there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to any of this. And I do think that even if you are practicing mindfulness in an interactive environment, or you're just trying to give yourself mental cues, that may be a very good fit for you if you don't want to go into the extreme sport. And it may open some doors so you begin to see, because it is in the nature of reality itself to engage this way. And when those doors open up, you begin to see more of what it is. So that's the reason why I think bringing in other forms of practicing mindfulness, I think it's very useful and beneficial to people, and that the meditation forms are not for everyone. I hope that's gets at what you were asking, does it?
It's great. Thank you. That was really helpful. I guess I was also thinking in terms of just life experiences that you get through. My own sense of it is that I'm much more mindful than I was when I first met you. I've been through different experiences. I've developed more of an ability to concentrate and to have that equanimity. And some of it comes through various experiences and interactions and just getting through them and understanding life differently through that.
Well, you know, I agree with you. I think it's, again, in the nature of our reality for us to meet and gain these kinds of experiences. But then the other side of the coin is that growing older does not necessarily mean growing wiser. So I like people to know that it's not just growing older. You have to actually cultivate some things along the way. And, you know, if most of the time you are freaking out in your life and comparing yourself to others, you're going to get better at that over time, because, again, you're practicing it. So your mind is going to go to the freaking out or to the anxiety. So I do think if you're paying close attention to life, or at least in some ways you're free to pay attention, that it is the nature of life to teach us to have greater concentration and equanimity as we move through. But again, just getting older doesn't mean that any individual is going to get that. But it does make sense that you have gained that over time, because you were also making an effort, I imagine.
Yeah, I've definitely been making an effort. And it also occurs to me that interactions with particular people who modeled in some fashion the equanimity, the mindfulness, made a big difference. And that brought to mind what there was something you said earlier, you know, in response to dealing with our current situation, saying hello or whatever. It seems like that there's a bit of the mindfulness, a bit of the equanimity that can be a little bit contagious, or give other people a different experience of how to respond to a given situation. And just by that experience, it can be a nugget of something that brings about the possibility for change.
That's perfect. That's exactly perfect. That's the way I see it all. You know, it's like if you bring mindfulness into the meeting with somebody, it's like you're arising together. You're not just a self, yourself and other. So they're also getting it. So you have a benefit of keeping your own ears and eyes open, but they're getting a benefit, comes automatically just by having that attitude, you know, in their purview or whatever. And so the more that you have this attitude towards the beings around you, the more that attitude also goes into them, the more they have it with other beings. And so it spreads out like that, like a ripple on a pond. So it's endless, actually, ultimately, just even small moments of it. So thank you for bringing that out. That's perfect.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the role you've played, as I said, in various ways, in helping me to find that for myself.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Someone has asked, is there a benefit to 2 short formal sitting sessions a day, perhaps 10 minutes in the morning and 10 in the evening, or do you need to sit for a longer time to reap long-term equanimity?
There's a benefit for any degree of mindfulness practice, anywhere, anytime, anyhow. So there's always benefit. But 2 short sittings a day as a foundation for really developing, how do I want to say it? It's just hard to say it. If you do the 2 short sittings and you bring it into your walking around life, that's really a good way to get started. And it might actually be enough to allow you to understand the benefits of mindfulness. It's very likely not to be enough to really, let's say, allow you to be in contact with your own mind when you're emotionally activated. So when we get emotionally activated, it is so difficult for us not to freak out or not to run or not to fight, that if you have a bigger foundation in practice, so either practicing through real dialogue or practicing through something that cultivates concentration and equanimity, I think you can practice it through rock climbing, through ice skating, through these kinds of activities, and then bring it into your relationships to expand it. If you're practicing mindfulness for a spiritual reason, that you want to open up the categories of a spiritual insight and so on, you definitely need more than short practice times for formal practice. But getting going, it's good to do it. Then once you get going, once you have a foundation, once you've got your seat, so to speak, then having 2 short times a day can remind your mind of what it knows already. And then you can do your longer times, maybe, on a weekend, as long as you do sometimes take retreats where you have even longer times to work with your mind. So I hope that's not a confusing answer.
And this is a good one to end on here. So can Polly share one tip for this is a quote of yours, bringing the freshness home in these times when we're not seeing any friendly strangers, like a saying or just bringing something to mind, just a suggestion for that?
Well, I think probably it is the idea of, opening a space or lowering your threat level, feeling the air on your face. It gives you a space in which you can feel that equanimity and concentration. And as Gika was saying, as soon as you can share that with somebody, they also feel it. So bringing in that kind of mindful gap or that mindful space, that moment of equanimity and concentration, that's a really great way to bring a little fresh air into the room that, might seem so much tangled up with all of our feelings about each other when we, walk into the living room or the kitchen right now. So.
That's great. So it's 5 o'clock, so we're out of time for today, but I did want to mention a few things to everyone before we go, and that is Living Together. Session 6 is this Saturday at 11 o'clock Eastern. And if you would like to catch up, those recordings are available on the website, Young-Eisendrath.com. And we'll be together again here next Monday at this same time and for the second session, and that's Why Should Mindfulness Be Grounded in Buddhism? So you can sign up for that class currently. And if you have any other interest in Polly's work, she's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and of course at Young-Eisendrath.com. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Gika, particularly.
Thank you, Polly.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.